Ah, Miss Bateman. Welcome back to... It's been... Nurse Blake... A bit of... You must... Give my regards to your father. Nurse Blake... Look at your death.
Dearest Mother, I hope this letter... I have spent these past... What I am about to recount... I will endeavour to as far as I... The letter brought me to the isolated village. No station master in sight. I hope the village isn't too far away. I can't recall our exact meeting place. Mr. Shoulder mentioned it in his letter. My mother always... If I take the sign, how would the train... I ought to read Mr. Shoulder's letter again. I can't recall... I ought to... read... I ought to... My mother... Hello? Hello? If I take... Hello? Hello? Hello there? The post looks unattended. Bewley. A path stretches off across the moor. I ought to read Mr. Shoulder's letter again. I can't recall the... I ought to read... I ought to read Miss... A path... A path... I ought to read... I ought... A path... I ought to read... Hello there? I ought to read... I ought... A path stretch... I ought to... I ought to... Hello there. I ought to... I ought to... I ought to read Mr. Shoulder. I ought... The po... A door of fine a path straight. I ought... I ought... I... I ought to read... I ought... I ought to... I ought to... I ought to read Mr. Shoulder. A path straight. A path stretch. I ought to read Mr. Shoulder's letter again. Hello? Hello? A door of... Hell. I ought to... I ought... I ought... I ought... I ought... I ought... I ought to... I ought... I ought... A path. I ought... I ought... I ought... I ought... I ought... Hello there. I ought... I ought to... I ought... I ought... I ought to... I ought... I ought... I ought... I ought to... I ought... I ought to... I ought... I ought to read Mr. Shaw. I ought to... I ought... If I take the sun... My mother...